So today's video is going to be pretty special. It's going to be the first time where we're going to cross over Battle Network 1 and Battle Network 2. And not just that, I also decided to add Magicman to the mix. So as of the making of this video, we have 10 out of the 17 navis we need to complete this series. So what the plan essentially is going forward is that once we're halfway into the series, I'm going to do an encore special, where we're going to get guests from the sequel series, and they're going to fight the navis from the current series. We actually have a ton of fights to get through today, and I'm recording this right now, and I can tell this video is going to be pretty long. The thing is, it's not just going to be CPU versus, there's going to be a more mathematical, in-depth analysis later in the video. We're going to be looking over how Napalman or Gospel are going to influence the ELO system over time, if they were to fight in Battle Network 1. So the first few fights you're going to see is going to be with Magicman, and then we're going to get to Gospel and Napalman. So let's get started. Now it's time to get to the fun part of the video, and just be aware, some of these fights are pretty free. But I think you're still going to enjoy the fights, so have fun. I was really hoping that it was going to be close, but that probably wasn't going to happen. And the reason is because Bass moves really quick, he does a lot of damage, and Gospel is like this impenetrable wall, whereas Bass is like this unstoppable force. But Bass does like 300 damage, and Gospel at most does 100. Unless you're an element-based user, once he is at like the last 25% of his HP, he uses his Gospel Breath, and that does like 200 damage. Now let's see how Napalman does. I gotta say, that was a jaw-dropping performance. Bad jokes aside, there's a reason why this fight was so close. Gospel has two ways which he can inflict damage without taking damage, and that's because of bug frags and drillhead. In fact, while observing the matches, what I noticed specifically that Gospel's ability to win was connected to how often he used drillhead. However, in the original game, what I noticed was that Gospel's attack were much more widespread. You wouldn't really see him spamming drillhead 4 or 5 times in a row, which in this case I used RNG, so it's very much possible to see attacks come out like 5 times in a row. I.e., this would be more like 9-1 in favor of Napalman versus the 7-3 in favor of Napalman. So if you thought Gospel was hardcore, well, Napalman is on a totally different level. There are 3 things that make Napalman terrifying. The first one is once his bombs hit tiles, they crack. That's an obvious. But what might not be so obvious is once the fire status is inflicted, if an NPC touches those fire panels, it won't inflict flashing. So that's easily 280 HP gone. Not to mention, he moves around really fast. Let's say that Bass and Napalman fought 10 games straight. How do you think Bass did against Napalman? 5-5, 2-8, 7-3. Do you think that he won against Napalman? Unfortunately, he did not do well against Napalman. In fact, it was completely one-sided. Napalman won all 10 matches. And now we're going to get to the really interesting part of this video. We're going to apply 3 different types of buffs to Bass, and we're going to test them. The first buff we're going to do is what I refer to as procedural growth. And that basically just means you go into the code editor and you increase his attack to X amount. In this case, we're going to choose 600. And you might be thinking that is an insane amount, and you're correct. That is an insane amount. But that's because I'd done a lot of testing before I decided to go with 600. The second type of buff is actually a mouthful. It's called a stochastic differential equation, and here's an image of it on the screen. This is a mathematical representation of how Bass is going to get stronger over time. Every 10 frames, Bass's attack will increase. Not only will his attack continue to increase, the rate at which his attack is increasing will increase if he takes damage. And the final model is actually a partial differential equation. Not just a partial differential equation, you can also call this a stochastic partial differential equation. Without going into too much detail, because this math is a bit advanced, kind of, what's happening is now not only is his damage increasing, but also his attack rate is increasing, and in turn his mobility is increasing, which results in higher damage output. And just for short form, we're going to call the stochastic differential equation SDE and the other one PDE. So let's begin. So after doing tons of testing, these were the results. And what I mean by that was that mistakes were made and I had to do retesting. Now bear in mind the sample size is a bit small for each growth, but I think it is a pretty decent representation, except the PDE representation feels a little bit weird to me. For procedural growth, it was a tie. It was 5-5. For the SDE, it was actually quite in favor of Napalman, it was 8-2. And then we get to the PDE where it's a little bit weird. In my records, I have 6-4 in favor of Napalman. But then when I was retesting it, this time Bass dusted Napalman, and it was something like in the ballpark of 3-7 in favor of Bass. My opinion on the PDE situation, I think Bass is definitely the stronger one. But to me, it's genuinely insane that Bass can have damage as high as 900 and still lose to Napalman. I was recently rewatching K&I John's videos, specifically his Megaman Battle Network 2 retrospective. And he was complaining about how Napalman is probably one of the worst designed navis in the game, if not probably all of Battle Network. And at first I made light of this comment, but running these tests shows that he actually has a good point. But even I can attest to the fact that when I was playing Battle Network 2 and fighting the version 3 of Napalman, I kinda struggled when trying to kill him just with the Buster. And I'm talking about with Buster Max on. So in regards to Megaman Battle Network CPU versus, it's possible that if we were to merge the entire series together, I'm talking about if Napalman was to fight navis from Battle Network 5 and 6 and 4, etc., he might be somewhere in the top 10 to top 15. Definitely not on the same level as, say, Bass XX from Battle Network 4 and Battle Network 5, but anyone that uses projectiles is basically screwed against them. So now if we were to put Napalman and Gospel so far with the Navi pool that we have in Battle Network 1, what would their ELOs be, and how would they affect the ELO system? Who would have the highest ELO, and what's the highest potential ELO that Navi can reach? So here's the most up-to-date ELO rankings for the Canon series. Now here's the ELO rankings with Gospel and Napalman included. This probably doesn't surprise a lot of you, but currently the highest ELO is 2232, belonging to Napalman. And unfortunately I'm a dummy and I lost some of my files where I kept win rates for all the navis, but right now Napalman is the only one with a win rate of 100%. The Navi with the second highest win rate is Bass, and he's only lost one fight, and you can guess who he lost it to. So let's just do a quick and dirty probabilistic algorithm that can determine how high Napalman's ELO can go. Given how high Napalman's ELO is, there's only 4 navis whose ELOs he can feed off of. Gospel, Sharkman, Shadowman, Bass. With our ELO system, the highest difference there can be in ELO is 710. Once the difference exceeds that, Napalman can no longer feed off of that Navi's ELO. Of these 4 navis, there's only really one Navi that can hamper Napalman's progress. And when I think about it a little bit, I think Gospel from the actual game may have a bit of a better chance than I originally gave him credit for. That reason being that the original actually spawns bug frags much more than the version that I created. But chances are the win rate is still somewhere in the ballpark of about 30% or so. So how high did Napalman's ELO reach? Well, after running only one test, it reached an ELO of 2251. And yes, it's only one test, but here's the thing. Gospel is genuinely a threat to Napalman's ELO. Now Napalman is going to have to work hard to regain that 30 or so points of ELO that he lost. In other words, even if I did do extensive testing, chances are his ELO will probably just break 2300 at best. But this isn't really something to worry about right now. We could get back to it in the future, or hell, even if you want to test it, you could test it yourself. So we're at the end of the video, and I want to give a special thank you to Mega Rock Reborn from the Rockman EXE zone. He's made my life 1,000 times easier thanks to the sprites he provided, and I always thank him in the description. So what the plans are is I'm actually gonna wrap up the Megaman Battle Network 1 CPU versus soon enough, hopefully in about 6 or so months. And what I plan on doing is I plan on actually working on a Yu Yu Hakusho video specifically related to the power hierarchies. And the video is going to include an Unreal Engine simulation. And then after that, I'm probably going to work on an ML series related to Megaman, though I'm not going to say what it is just yet. And then after all that, I'm going to get back to Megaman Battle Network 2 CPU versus. And here and there in between, you might get like some sort of junk food video, like a video game review. You know, those are quick and cheap to make. So if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.